The universe of Warhammer 40k is a realm of endless conflict, inhabited by a multitude of factions, each with their own goals, motives, and histories. Among them, the Eldar stand out not only for their unparalleled technological achievements and psychic abilities, but also for their complex relationship with the divine. The Eldar once had a pantheon of gods, beings of immense power and influence, who guided their civilization to heights of greatness. But that was long ago, and much has changed since then. The fall of the Eldar is a tale steeped in tragedy, a story of hubris, excess, and the inevitable consequences of a civilization blinded by its own power. The gods of the Eldar were once revered as the pillars of their existence, shaping the destiny of their people in ways that spanned millennia. Yet the rise of the Dark Prince, Slaanesh, marked the end of their divine reign. The birth of this chaos god tore through the Eldar pantheon, scattering their gods and leaving the Eldar in a state of desperate survival. Their once proud civilization was reduced to a shattered remnant scattered across the stars, clinging to life on the fringes of the galaxy. In the aftermath of this cataclysmic event, the Eldar have struggled to find their place in a universe increasingly dominated by other races, most notably the Imperium of Man and forces of chaos that continue to grow in strength. Yet, amid the despair and the ongoing wars that plague the galaxy, there are whispers among the Eldar that their gods may not be gone forever. The question lingers. Could the Eldar gods return? This question is not merely one of faith, but one that holds immense significance for the future of the Eldar and the balance of the galaxy. For if the gods were to return, it could mean the restoration of the Eldar to their former glory, a rebirth that could change the course of history. But the path to their return is fraught with danger, uncertainty, and the weight of ancient knowledge that must be uncovered. The forces at play are not merely cosmic, but deeply personal, as the Eldar face their own inner demons and conflicting desires for the future. To understand the potential for the return of the Eldar gods, we must first look at the history that led to their fall, the events that shaped their departure from the material world, and the remnants of their legacy that still linger in the galaxy. The story of the Eldar gods is one of divine power, of lost potential, and of the unyielding struggle to reclaim what was once lost. But it is also a story of hope, of the possibility that even in the darkest of times, the divine can find a way to return. As we delve deeper into this topic, we will examine the key players involved in the potential return of the Eldar gods, the forces and factions that might stand in the way or aid in their resurrection, and the ancient technologies and rituals that could be used to bring about their return. But we will also explore the mysteries and unanswered questions that surround the fate of the Eldar gods. Could they truly come back, or are they forever lost to the annals of time? The journey ahead will reveal not only the secrets of the Eldar gods, but also the profound impact their return could have on the galaxy. The stakes are high, and the consequences of failure are unimaginable. Yet, for the Eldar, the possibility of their god's return represents a glimmer of hope in a universe that is increasingly bleak and unforgiving. The question is not just whether the Eldar gods could return, but whether they should. The story of the Eldar gods is inextricably linked to the fate of the Eldar race itself, as the gods were once the guiding forces behind their civilization. However, following the fall of the Eldar, both the gods and the people of the Eldar have evolved into separate entities, each struggling with their own existence in a galaxy increasingly hostile to them. The potential return of the Eldar gods is a matter that involves not only the gods themselves, but also various factions within the Eldar and other forces that might influence their fate. The first group central to this tale are the Eldar, the once great race whose decline has been tied directly to the downfall of their gods. The Eldar are a race of incredibly gifted and ancient beings who once stood at the height of their power. They are known for their psychic abilities, superior technology, and an understanding of the warp that few other races can comprehend. But as their empire crumbled, so too did their faith in the gods who had guided them. The Eldar's role in the potential return of their gods is complex. They are both the bearers of their god's legacy and the ones who must face the consequences of their absence. For some, the return of the gods represents a hope for restoration and redemption. For others, the gods' return may bring more harm than good. They are divided into factions that each have their own ideas about the gods' return and the future of the Eldar. In particular, the Asuryani, the most well-known and populous faction of Eldar, have a deep connection to their gods. They are the descendants of the Eldar who survived the fall and now live in craft worlds, vast artificial worlds that serve as the last bastions of their people. The Asuryani, as a race, carry the legacy of the Eldar gods and their culture, yet their belief in the gods has evolved. While some still revere the gods, others view them with a more pragmatic eye, seeing them as part of a lost past rather than as a force to be reawakened. In this way, the Asuryani represent the split within the Eldar. Some hold on to the hope of their god's return, while others have accepted that the gods may never rise again. The role of the Asuryani in the potential return of the gods is critical, as they hold the knowledge and the traditions of their people that may be key to unlocking the power of the gods. Alongside the Asuryani, there is another faction that plays a significant role in the events surrounding the Eldar gods, the Drukhari. The Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, are a splinter group of the Eldar who chose a darker path after the fall of their empire. Unlike the Asuryani, who withdrew to the craft worlds, the Drukhari embraced the darker aspects of their nature, feeding off the suffering of others to survive. Their relationship with the gods is notably different from that of the Asuryani. The Drukhari never fully embraced the teachings of the Eldar pantheon, and in many cases turned away from their gods entirely. However, their knowledge of the Eldar gods and the warp makes them a crucial element in the potential return of the gods. The Drukhari's role is one of caution and skepticism. While they may not actively seek the return of the gods, their understanding of the hidden truths of the Eldar pantheon might be pivotal. The third group of Eldar to consider is the Harlequins, a mysterious and enigmatic faction whose role in the fate of the Eldar gods is profound yet secretive. The Harlequins serve as the keepers of the Eldar's most sacred traditions, particularly those relating to the gods. They are the ones who carry out the performances, rituals, and ceremonies that preserve the lore of the Eldar pantheon. Unlike the Asuryani or the Drukhari, the Harlequins still actively worship the gods and seek to preserve the memory of their existence. However, their beliefs are often seen as a matter of faith rather than a practical reality. For the Harlequins, the return of the gods is not just a possibility. It is an act of divine will. They see themselves as the chosen ones who must act as intermediaries between the gods and the mortal Eldar. Their knowledge and unwavering devotion to the gods place them in a unique position in the story of the gods' potential return. At the center of the narrative, however, are the gods themselves. The Eldar gods were once powerful beings who represented various aspects of Eldar existence, including war, craft, love, and death. These gods were revered as protectors and guides, providing the Eldar with the strength and wisdom they needed to conquer the galaxy. However, after the birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent fall of the Eldar, these gods were scattered or destroyed. Their fates are a mystery, and their potential return is the central question of this narrative. The gods are not merely abstract concepts. They were once real, tangible beings whose influence shaped the Eldar's very essence. Each god had a role to play in the life of the Eldar, and their return would bring with it profound changes to the galaxy. One of the most well-known of the Eldar gods is Cain, the god of war and murder. Cain's role in the Eldar pantheon was that of a warrior deity, guiding the Eldar in their battles and instilling in them the strength to overcome any adversary. However, Cain's godly essence was shattered when the fall of the Eldar took place, and his power was divided between various aspects of the Eldar. In the potential return of the gods, Cain's role would be a crucial one, as he represents not only the strength of the Eldar, but also the brutal nature of their past. Another god whose potential return holds significant weight is Isha, the goddess of life and fertility. Isha's role in the Eldar pantheon was to nurture and protect her people, ensuring that they could continue to thrive. Isha was one of the few gods to escape the ravages of the fall, and her possible return would signify a renewal of the Eldar's connection to their spiritual roots. She is a symbol of healing and regeneration, making her an essential figure in the rebirth of the Eldar. The role of the Eldar gods and their potential return is also tied to the larger cosmic forces at play in the Warhammer 40k universe. The gods of chaos, who are the antithesis of the Eldar gods, have been a constant threat to the galaxy. The return of the Eldar gods could create a delicate balance of power between these opposing forces. Whether this would result in peace, war, or something else entirely is a question that remains to be answered. As the Eldar face the possibility of their god's return, they are also confronted by other factions who have their own stake in the matter. The Imperium of Man, with its ever-expanding reach and zealous faith in the Emperor, sees the Eldar as a threat to their dominance. The forces of chaos, meanwhile, may see the return of the Eldar gods as a threat to their own ambitions. In the end, the potential return of the Eldar gods is not just about the Eldar alone. It is a question that concerns the entire galaxy, with each faction playing its part in the unfolding drama. The story of the Eldar gods begins long before their potential return, tracing back to the rise and eventual fall of the Eldar civilization. The Eldar gods were once central to the existence of the Eldar, guiding them through every aspect of life, from war to creation to love and death. Their influence was felt in every corner of the galaxy, as the Eldar flourished under the divine protection of these beings. However, this golden age came to an end, a calamity that not only shattered their civilization, but also decimated the gods themselves. The events that led to this downfall are deeply tied to the nature of the Eldar and their relationship with power, excess, and belief. At the height of their civilization, the Eldar had reached a level of advancement and sophistication unparalleled in the galaxy. They were a psychic race, gifted with an unparalleled mastery over the warp, which they used to propel their society to heights of achievement. This power, however, became a double-edged sword. The Eldar's psychic abilities were not just tools for exploration or defense, but for indulgence and excess. As their civilization grew, so too did their desires, and the Eldar began to seek pleasure and satisfaction without limitation. They indulged in hedonistic lifestyles, their psychic abilities allowing them to manifest their wildest fantasies without restraint. This unrestrained pursuit of excess would prove to be their undoing. The nature of this excess was not merely physical or emotional, it was also spiritual. The Eldar gods themselves were reflections of the aspects of life that the Eldar most revered. They represented the very ideals that had shaped the Eldar civilization: strength, creation, love, war, and death. However, as the Eldar's indulgence grew, so too did their collective psychic presence in the warp. The warp, a realm of pure psychic energy, is home to the forces of chaos, who thrive on the emotions and desires of sentient beings. The Eldar, through their unchecked psychic powers, inadvertently created a psychic maelstrom within the warp, a new entity fueled by their excess and hedonism. This new being would come to embody the darkest aspect of their desires and the very thing they had given life to: Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, pleasure, and excess. The birth of Slaanesh was the culmination of the Eldar's hedonistic practices, a being that fed on their desires and consumed the very soul of the Eldar race. The birth of Slaanesh was a cataclysmic event, one that destroyed the Eldar gods and shattered the fabric of Eldar civilization. As Slaanesh came into being, the warp was torn asunder, and the Eldar race found themselves facing the full brunt of their own excess. The gods, once powerful beings who had guided and protected the Eldar, were consumed by the birth of Slaanesh. Kane, the god of war, was shattered into countless fragments. Isha, the goddess of life and fertility, was captured and taken by Nurgle, one of the Chaos gods. The other gods, too, were lost to the void or twisted beyond recognition. The Eldar, who had once been masters of the galaxy, were now a broken and scattered race, their gods lost to the winds of the warp. In the aftermath of this event, the Eldar's once great empire collapsed. The survivors, a small fraction of the race, retreated to their craft worlds, vast artificial worlds designed to protect them from the wrath of the warp and the influence of chaos. These craft worlds became the last refuge of the Eldar, where they lived in isolation, separated from the rest of the galaxy and from the gods who had once guided them. However, the loss of the gods did not mean the end of the Eldar's connection to the divine. The Eldar's psychic abilities remained, though they were now constrained by the need to protect themselves from the predations of chaos. The craft world Eldar became a people torn between their past and their present, between their former power and their current state of survival. Despite the fall of their gods and the destruction of their empire, the Eldar continued to retain fragments of their old beliefs and traditions. Some Eldar still held out hope that their gods might one day return, that the divine power that had once guided them could be restored. However, this hope was tempered by the knowledge that the birth of Slaanesh had altered the very fabric of the warp, making it impossible for the Eldar gods to return in the same form as before. The Eldar gods, if they could return at all, would need to find a way to transcend the corruption of the warp and reclaim their lost power. In the wake of the Eldar gods' fall, the forces of chaos gained strength, and the galaxy became an increasingly dangerous place for the remnants of the Eldar. The rise of the imperium of man, along with the growth of the chaos powers, further pushed the Eldar to the brink of extinction. As the imperium spread across the galaxy, the Eldar were forced into a defensive posture, their once great empire reduced to a series of isolated pockets of resistance. The Eldar gods, once symbols of hope and protection, now became distant memories, their return a fading dream that many believed was impossible. The Drukhari, the dark side of the Eldar, also played a role in the aftermath of the fall. Unlike their more cautious cousins in the craft worlds, the Drukhari embraced the darkest aspects of their nature. They turned to the warp and the powers of chaos to sustain themselves, feeding off the suffering of others to survive. While they did not actively seek the return of the gods, their actions and their existence were a constant reminder of the forces that had torn apart the Eldar's once great empire. The Drukhari, in their own way, embodied the worst aspects of the Eldar's descent into excess, and their survival in the wake of the fall was a reflection of the dark path the Eldar had once walked. The Eldar, both craft-worlders and Drukhari, were not the only players in the aftermath of the fall of the gods. The forces of chaos, led by Slaanesh and the other dark gods, reveled in the destruction of the Eldar and sought to further corrupt and dominate the remnants of the race. Meanwhile, the Imperium of Man, in its zealous campaign to cleanse the galaxy of all Xenos threats, viewed the Eldar as a threat to humanity's supremacy. The Eldar were no longer the dominant force they once were. They were a race on the brink of extinction, their gods lost and their future uncertain. The events that led to the fall of the Eldar gods, and the aftermath of that fall, set the stage for the current situation the Eldar face. The gods, if they could ever return, would need to overcome the corruption of Slaanesh and the forces of chaos. They would need to find a way to transcend the destruction of their race and the scar that has been left on the warp itself. The hope for the return of the Eldar gods is a faint one, but it is a hope that still lingers in the hearts of some of the Eldar. For them, the potential return of the gods represents not only a chance for redemption, but a way to reclaim their lost glory. However, this hope is fraught with danger, as the forces that oppose the Eldar are numerous and powerful. The possibility of the Eldar Gods' return is intertwined with the long and tumultuous history of the Eldar race. While their eventual disappearance left a profound void in the psyche of the Eldar, the idea of their return has remained a distant yet persistent dream. Over millennia, several key stages have emerged in the potential rebirth of these gods. The stages themselves represent the evolution of hope, desperation, and the increasingly complex nature of the Eldar's struggle to restore what was lost. Each stage marks a different point in time, where actions, beliefs, and the shifting balance of power either hindered or encouraged the chance of the Eldar gods' revival. In the aftermath of the fall, the remnants of the Eldar civilization were scattered across the galaxy. The craft worlds, home to the more cautious survivors, became a sanctuary of sorts, safe from the ravages of chaos. It was during this time that the first glimmer of hope for the return of the gods appeared. However, this hope was not based solely on belief, but was interwoven with the practical, often desperate, measures the Eldar took to survive. The emergence of the Eye of Terror and the influence of chaos marked a critical point in the galaxy's trajectory, creating a fundamental shift in how the Eldar began to see their relationship with the divine. The first stage of the potential return of the Eldar gods occurred in the wake of the creation of the craft worlds. The Eldar, now isolated from the rest of the galaxy, focused on their survival, carefully maintaining their psychic abilities while keeping a wary distance from the corrupted forces of chaos. During this period, some Eldar began to realize that the gods could not simply be wished back into existence. Instead, the concept of the gods' return began to take on a more tangible aspect. A few of the surviving Eldar, particularly those with close ties to the ancient ways of the gods, began to explore the idea of rekindling their old powers, though they remained deeply wary of the warp's dangerous nature. They believed that if they could find a way to communicate with the warp, or perhaps even harness the divine energies once embodied by the gods, they might find a path to restoration. The second stage of the process began with the creation of the Webway and the Eldar's attempt to navigate this newly expanded space. The Webway, a vast network of portals connecting distant points in the galaxy, was a critical part of the Eldar's ancient methods of travel. However, the Webway's connection to the warp and the dangers it posed also became central to the potential return of the gods. It was during this stage that certain factions within the Eldar began experimenting with the idea of accessing hidden or forgotten realms within the Webway. They theorized that these realms could hold the key to reviving the Eldar gods. Some believed that the gods themselves had retreated into the Webway, hidden away by the forces of chaos after their destruction. This notion sparked a renewed interest in finding ways to access the deeper, more dangerous corners of the Webway, and perhaps, by doing so, to reconnect with the divine entities lost so long ago. However, this search for the gods was fraught with danger. The forces of chaos were ever present, and the more the Eldar delved into the secrets of the Webway, the more they risked falling victim to the temptations of chaos. The Drukhari, in particular, used the Webway for their own dark purposes, feeding off the suffering of others while seeking their own twisted form of immortality. While their methods differed from the more righteous efforts of the craft world Eldar, they too were drawn into the web of possibilities that the Webway held. For the Drukhari, the return of the gods held no promise of redemption, but rather the possibility of using the gods' power for their own ends. Their corrupted nature and twisted desires further complicated the Eldar's efforts, as they were both an ally and an adversary in the struggle for the gods' return. The third stage in the potential revival of the Eldar gods was marked by the rise of the Aeneid, the god of death. Aeneid's creation, brought about by the sacrifices and rituals of the Eldar, signified a new chapter in the race's relationship with the divine. Ennead was not one of the original gods, but a new entity, one forged in the aftermath of the fall. The birth of Ennead was a significant event in the spiritual landscape of the Eldar, and it hinted at the possibility that new gods could emerge from the collective will and power of the Eldar themselves. Ennead's rise did not directly restore the old gods, but it signaled the potential for new divine entities to take form in the warp. This marked a turning point in how the Eldar viewed the return of their gods. It was no longer solely about resurrecting the old gods, but also about creating new forces that could fulfill the roles left vacant by the destruction of the ancient deities. The fourth stage involved a more focused effort on the part of certain factions to directly challenge the forces of chaos and reclaim their divine heritage. As the Eldar slowly began to rebuild their position in the galaxy, both politically and spiritually, they began to realize that the return of the gods could not be achieved through passive hope. They would have to take action, face the consequences of their past, and confront the forces of chaos head-on. This phase marked an escalation in the involvement of the Eldar gods, particularly Ennead, who was seen as a symbol of hope for the return of the divine. However, this also brought them into direct conflict with the forces of chaos, as the Chaos Gods were not willing to simply relinquish their hold over the Eldar's psychic presence. This stage saw the development of new strategies and tactics by the Eldar, incorporating both their ancient traditions and new methods of combating the forces of chaos. These efforts were not limited to the craft worlds, as certain factions within the Drukhari also began to see the potential benefits of working with the emerging power of Ennead. However, the Drukhari's relationship with the other Eldar remained complex, as they had no intention of renouncing their dark ways. Their desire for power and immortality continued to complicate the situation, creating tension between the factions that were united in their shared goal of returning the gods. The final stage, which remains ongoing, centers around the increasingly complex relationship between the Eldar and their gods. While the return of the original Eldar gods seems unlikely due to the nature of the warp and the actions of chaos, the birth of Ennead represents a glimmer of hope. However, the path to reclaiming divine power is fraught with danger, as the forces of chaos continue to hold sway over much of the warp. The gods' return would require the Eldar to navigate not only the perilous currents of the warp, but also the deep-seated corruption that lingers from the fall. Whether or not the Eldar gods will ever truly return is uncertain, but the ongoing efforts to restore their divine presence demonstrate that the Eldar are not yet willing to give up on their lost legacy. The key decision or event that fundamentally shapes the possibility of the Eldar gods' return is the birth of Ennead, the god of death. This is the pivotal turning point that significantly alters the Eldar's trajectory, offering a decisive shift in the balance between their spiritual hopes and the reality of their struggle against the forces of chaos. The birth of Ennead was not just a singular act, but a complex culmination of Eldar actions, sacrifices, and spiritual endeavors. It represents the moment when the Eldar's belief in the restoration of their gods changed from a distant, almost abstract dream to something far more tangible, a new divine being that might one day play a pivotal role in the salvation of their race. The decision to bring Ennead into being was driven by the desperate need of the Eldar to confront the consequences of the fall and the overwhelming presence of chaos. After the catastrophic events that led to the birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent annihilation of their gods, the Eldar were left with a void in their pantheon, one that echoed throughout the galaxy. The Eldar realized that the return of their original gods, the deities that had once guided them, was an impossible prospect. Chaos had destroyed the foundation of their divine realm, and the gods themselves had vanished from existence in the wake of the fall. However, the birth of Ennead signified the possibility of rebirth, a new god emerging from the collective strength and will of the Eldar people. Ennead's birth is a statement of faith and a reflection of the Eldar's resolve to reclaim their lost divine power. While Ennead's emergence did not directly restore the original gods, it marked a significant shift in their thinking. The Eldar had to acknowledge that the gods they once worshipped were unlikely to return in their original forms. Instead, they had to focus on creating something new, something that could carry the mantle of their ancient gods' power and bring hope to the surviving Eldar. The formation of Aeneid was seen as a necessary act, not only to counterbalance the forces of chaos, but also to begin healing the deep spiritual wounds left by the fall. This decision also carried with it enormous risks. The forces of chaos, particularly Slaanesh, were unlikely to allow such a god to emerge without contest. The birth of Aeneid did not go unnoticed in the warp, and its significance was immediately felt by the chaos gods. Slaanesh, the god of excess and destruction, took particular offense to the formation of Aeneid, viewing it as an affront to its very existence. The eldritch power of the warp was fiercely contested, and the creation of a new Eldar god was seen as an act of defiance that had the potential to disrupt the already fragile balance of the imperium. Nevertheless, the decision to bring Aeneid into being was driven by necessity rather than ambition. The Eldar had no choice but to forge a new god, as their ancient pantheon could not be restored. The creation of Aeneid represented the last best hope for the Eldar's survival and the reclaiming of their lost spiritual power. It was a decision that acknowledged the impossibility of resurrecting the past, but also embraced the future. It was the first real step toward overcoming the catastrophic loss of their gods and taking charge of their fate in the galaxy. The birth of Aeneid did not guarantee the immediate restoration of the Eldar gods, nor did it promise an easy path to the gods' return. It was a decision made in the face of overwhelming adversity and was driven by the stark realization that the Eldar could not remain in the past. The future lay in the creation of new divine entities that could stand against the forces of chaos and ultimately restore the Eldar to their former glory. However, the question of whether this would be enough remains open, as Aeneid itself is not the original god of the Eldar, but a new being forged from the very essence of their people. Was it the right decision? Yes. While the return of the Eldar gods as they were before the fall may be beyond the grasp of the Eldar, the creation of Aeneid marks the beginning of a new chapter in their spiritual journey. It signifies that the Eldar are not simply content to wait for salvation, but instead are actively forging a new path forward. The decision to give birth to Aeneid represents a turning point in their collective will to overcome the hardships imposed by chaos and the cosmic forces that once destroyed their civilization. This choice does not erase the devastation of the fall or restore the Eldar gods in their original forms, but it does offer a new hope. It signifies that the Eldar gods in some form could indeed return, not as they once were, but as a new emergent power. The ultimate question now is not whether the gods will return, but how they will manifest in a galaxy torn apart by war and dominated by the forces of chaos. The creation of Aeneid has set in motion the possibility for further divine rebirth, but the outcome remains uncertain. The key to understanding the significance of this event is to recognize that the Eldar were forced to adapt. They could not simply wish for their gods to return. Instead, they had to redefine their understanding of divinity and create a new path to salvation. Aeneid is the manifestation of that path, a symbol of the Eldar's resilience and determination to reclaim their place in the galaxy. Whether or not the other gods will follow remains to be seen, but Aeneid's birth is the decisive act that has opened the door to that possibility. The departure of the Eldar gods had profound and lasting consequences on the galaxy and the spiritual fabric of the Eldar race. In the wake of their disappearance, the Eldar were left to grapple with a vast spiritual void, a gap that had existed since the birth of Slaanesh, when their gods were consumed by the forces of chaos. This loss led to both immediate and long-term effects on the Eldar, their culture, and their role in the galaxy. And the possibility of their god's return carries with it significant implications for the future. Initially, the Eldar found themselves bereft of divine guidance. The gods had been central to the spiritual life of the Eldar, offering wisdom, protection, and a sense of purpose. The absence of these deities left a deep void, and many Eldar struggled to maintain their faith. This loss was not merely an emotional or spiritual blow, but had practical consequences as well. Without the gods' influence, the Eldar lost much of their direction, which compounded the trauma of the fall and their diminished numbers. This period of upheaval led to a scattering of the Eldar across the galaxy, with many seeking solace in alternate paths or embracing nihilistic philosophies. Others, like the craft world Eldar, turned inward, creating isolated, self-sufficient societies that sought to preserve their race's knowledge and culture. However, the power vacuum left by the Eldar gods did not simply result in spiritual disarray. It also had a direct impact on the state of the galaxy. The Eldar had long been a major force, and with their gods gone, their influence waned. Their once mighty empire, which had been a dominant force in the galaxy, fractured, leading to a decline in their political and military power. The destruction of their pantheon not only altered their societal structures, but also caused their relationship with the warp to change. Without the guiding influence of their gods, the Eldar's connection to the imperium became more erratic and volatile. In the aftermath, many of the Eldar turned away from the warp, seeking other means to survive in a galaxy increasingly dominated by chaos and other threats. With the gods gone, the Eldar's reliance on their own power increased. The ability to call upon their deities in times of great need was no longer an option. Instead, the Eldar had to rely on their own ingenuity, resilience, and ancient technology. This led to the development of new forms of defense and self-preservation. Craft worlds became the cornerstone of the Eldar's continued survival, their psychic shields and advanced technology allowing them to remain a viable force despite their reduced numbers. However, their loss of spiritual guidance meant they were also isolated from the deeper aspects of their culture. The Eldar's role in the galaxy shifted from one of dominance to one of survival, with their once proud race now struggling to maintain relevance in a galaxy filled with ever-growing threats. If the Eldar gods were to return, the impact on the galaxy would be far-reaching and profound. The return of these deities, especially in the form of Ennead, would signal a major shift in the balance of power. The presence of the gods would reinvigorate the Eldar, restoring a sense of purpose and identity that had been lost for millennia. With divine guidance, the Eldar could once again become a powerful force in the galaxy, potentially challenging the dominance of the Imperium and other factions that had risen to power in their absence. The return of the gods could help to reinstate the Eldar as a major power in the galaxy, reasserting their place as one of the most influential races in the universe. The return of the gods would also have far-reaching implications for the forces of chaos. Slaanesh, in particular, would be directly threatened by the rise of Ennead, the god of death, as a counterbalance to its excess and destruction. The resurgence of an Eldar god could weaken the grip of chaos on the Eldar race, as they would once again have the protection and favor of a divine force. This could lead to a renewed conflict between the forces of chaos and the Eldar, with the latter trying to reclaim their place in the warp and restore the balance that was shattered with the fall. Furthermore, the return of the Eldar gods would likely have an impact on the psychic landscape of the galaxy. The warp is a tumultuous and ever-changing realm, and the influence of a new god could shift the balance of power within it. Ennead, as a god of death, could have a unique role to play in the Imperium, potentially bringing stability or upheaval to the psychic energies that swirl within the warp. The rise of Ennead could lead to new forms of psychic power, and it may even cause a resurgence in the psychic abilities of the Eldar themselves, enabling them to once again tap into the power that had once been a hallmark of their race. The return of the Eldar gods would also have a profound effect on the relationships between the Eldar and other races. The Imperium, which had long viewed the Eldar as a threat, would likely see the return of their gods as an existential danger. The Imperium's forces would be forced to confront this new spiritual reality, and their perception of the Eldar would shift dramatically. The relationship between the two races, already fraught with tension and hostility, would grow even more complex and dangerous. Likewise, other factions, such as the Orcs and the Tyranids, would react to the return of the Eldar gods with a mixture of fear and aggression, as the return of a powerful force like the Eldar gods would undoubtedly destabilize the balance of power in the galaxy. The emergence of the Eldar gods would also have cultural and spiritual ramifications for the Eldar themselves. The return of their gods would reinvigorate their culture, reinstate ancient traditions, and potentially bring the Eldar closer to the greatness they once enjoyed. The gods would inspire a new wave of spiritual devotion and unity, uniting the fragmented factions of the Eldar under a common banner. The craft worlds would no longer be isolated entities, but part of a greater whole, driven by a renewed sense of purpose and connection to their gods. This would not only strengthen the Eldar race, but could also help them reclaim their lost knowledge and technology, leading to the revival of their former glory. The influence of the Eldar Gods Return could also have long-term effects on the broader cosmic order. The resurgence of divine beings in the galaxy would mark a shift in the underlying forces that govern the universe. The fabric of reality itself might be altered as the gods reassert their influence, potentially leading to changes in the balance between the material realm and the warp. The return of the gods could usher in a new era, one defined by the reawakening of ancient powers and the reassertion of the Eldar's place in the galaxy. In conclusion, the departure of the Eldar gods left a significant mark on the galaxy, leading to the downfall of the Eldar's once great empire, the fracturing of their cultural unity, and the weakening of their connection to the imperium. Their return would mark a profound shift in the galactic balance of power, offering the Eldar a chance to reclaim their former glory while challenging the forces of chaos and altering the fabric of reality itself. The consequences of such an event would be far-reaching and would reshape the galaxy in ways that are impossible to fully predict. However, one thing is certain: the return of the Eldar gods would signal the dawn of a new era, one in which the Eldar once again play a central role in the fate of the universe. The question of whether the Eldar gods could return to the material realm is one that has intrigued Warhammer 40k fans for decades. Beyond the more direct narrative implications, the discussion surrounding their potential return touches on deeper lore, concepts of the warp, and the shifting nature of fate itself. There are several unique aspects that make this topic especially captivating, many of which stem from the complex metaphysical and spiritual layers of the Warhammer 40k universe. Fans often debate not only the feasibility of such a return, but also what it would mean for the galaxy as a whole, and the Eldar race specifically. These aspects add depth to the concept and reveal just how many factors are involved in considering such a monumental event. One key topic that often arises in discussions about the Eldar gods' potential return is the nature of Ennead, the god of death, and its unique role in the cosmic order. Ennead is not simply a potential replacement for the Eldar gods lost during the fall. It represents a force that might embody a fundamental shift in how the Eldar perceive their relationship with both the Immaterium and the greater universe. While Slaanesh embodies excess, pleasure, and destruction, Ennead is associated with death and the natural end of all things. Many fans are intrigued by the idea that Ennead's return might not only re-establish the Eldar pantheon, but also create a new, more balanced dynamic within the warp itself. The fact that Ennead is often depicted as an entity of restraint and finality contrasts sharply with the chaotic and often destructive nature of other warp gods. If Ennead were to emerge as a true force within the material universe, it could signal a radical shift not just for the Eldar, but for the broader spiritual landscape of the galaxy. This idea of the return of a death god in contrast to the chaos of other warp deities also raises another point of discussion: the potential rebalancing of the warp itself. For years, the Immaterium has been dominated by the forces of chaos, with the major gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, vying for supremacy. The introduction of Ennead, a deity of death, might not only disrupt the balance between these chaos gods, but could also establish a new order. This shift has fascinated fans, especially when considering how the Eldar, with their deep understanding of the warp and psychic powers, could influence the outcome of such a cosmic rebalancing. The idea of the Eldar gods reasserting their influence in the warp opens up the possibility of new alliances, rivalries, and even the creation of new entities or forces within the imperium. Another aspect that is heavily discussed within the fan community is the potential influence of the remaining Eldar, specifically the craft worlds and their leadership, in shaping the return of their gods. The craft world Eldar have maintained a tenuous grasp on their cultural identity since the fall, clinging to the traditions and practices that preserved their race in the aftermath of their god's demise. These survivors are not only the last remnants of the Eldar Empire, but also the only faction of Eldar with a direct connection to their lost gods. The influence of the Farseers, who commune with the spirits of the dead, and the role of the Spirit Stones have led many to believe that the Eldar may hold the key to bringing their gods back. The intricate rituals and psychic practices of the craft worlds provide a unique backdrop for exploring the potential return of the gods. Fans often speculate whether the Eldar, through their mastery of psychic powers and their connection to the webway, might somehow breach the veil between the material world and the warp in a way that would allow their gods to manifest once again. The use of the webway itself is another fascinating point of discussion. The webway, an ancient network of portals that once allowed the Eldar to travel throughout the galaxy, plays a critical role in their survival and spiritual practices. It has been a source of speculation as to whether the webway could serve as the conduit for the return of the Eldar gods. The webway exists in a space that is neither fully within the material realm nor the warp, which makes it a potential bridge between the two. If the gods could be brought back, it is often assumed that this would occur through the webway, as it is a pathway to the imperium that the Eldar themselves control. The webway's existence and its connection to the fabric of reality make it an ideal tool for fans to explore theories about the gods' return, with many wondering if the Eldar could use it to navigate the shifting currents of the imperium and bring about the return of their divine ancestors. In connection with the webway, another unique aspect of the Eldar gods' potential return is the notion of the living Eldar gods. Unlike the passive worship of gods in other cultures, the Eldar gods are intrinsically tied to the very essence of their race. The idea of these gods being reconstituted and actively participating in the lives of their followers adds a layer of personal, almost intimate stakes to the question of their return. If the Eldar gods were to return, they would not be distant, uncaring entities. They would be interwoven into the daily existence of the Eldar. This is especially intriguing when considering the implications for the Farseers and other psychic individuals who commune with the dead. The possibility that the return of the gods would allow these individuals to directly interact with their deities is a concept that has captured the imagination of many fans, as it could create an entirely new dynamic within the Eldar society. Additionally, the role of the Eldar as a race that is constantly on the edge of extinction adds a layer of urgency to the question of whether their gods will return. The Eldar have long been depicted as a dying race, with their numbers dwindling and their civilization reduced to isolated pockets of survivors. The return of their gods would not only restore their spiritual connection to the past, but could also provide the Eldar with a means of revitalization. The potential for their gods to reignite the dormant psychic potential of their race, offering them a new path to survival, is a central theme in many fan discussions. The question of whether the Eldar could truly reclaim their former glory with the help of their gods is often debated in relation to the broader narrative of Warhammer 40k, where the stakes are always high, and the fate of entire civilizations often hangs in the balance. The Eldar Gods Return is also often explored in terms of their influence over the other races of the galaxy. While the Eldar themselves would benefit from their god's return, there are larger implications for the entire galaxy. How would the Imperium of Man react to the reemergence of these ancient beings? The rivalry between the Eldar and the forces of chaos, particularly Slaanesh, would reach new heights if the Eldar gods were to return. The potential for all-out cosmic conflict between these deities and the powers of chaos is a tantalizing idea that has been widely discussed in the fan community. Fans often speculate about how the presence of the Eldar gods would shift the delicate balance of power in the galaxy, and what this could mean for the ongoing wars between the forces of order and chaos. Finally, the return of the Eldar gods would fundamentally alter the nature of time, fate, and the warp itself. The gods of chaos have long been dominant within the Imperium, shaping the fate of mortals and creating a fractured reality in which the influence of these forces is constant. If the Eldar gods returned, it could bring about a reordering of these forces, fundamentally shifting the metaphysical currents that shape the universe. Fans often theorize about the implications of this rebalancing, wondering if the return of the Eldar gods might lead to a new era of cosmic order or chaos. The question of how the Eldar gods might interact with the existing forces of the warp, including the chaos gods, is a point of intrigue for many. In conclusion, the unique aspects of the Eldar gods' potential return center on their intrinsic connection to the race itself, the power of the webway, the possible creation of a new spiritual balance, and the wider impact on the galaxy. This topic offers a wide range of theories and concepts that have sparked the imaginations of fans. It goes beyond mere speculation about the return of these powerful beings. It touches on the very nature of reality, the fate of the Eldar, and the shifting forces that influence the galaxy. The question of whether the Eldar gods can return is not just about resurrecting deities. It is about the fate of a race and the balance of power in the universe itself. When discussing the potential return of the Eldar gods, it's crucial to examine the prominent figures associated with their legacy, including the gods themselves and those individuals who play pivotal roles in either the revival of these gods or the influence their return would have on the Eldar race. The Eldar gods were once powerful and revered beings, each embodying aspects of Eldar culture and psychology. In the current context of Warhammer 40k, some figures, both divine and mortal, strive toward the impossible, the return of these gods to the material realm. Their qualities, motivations, strengths, and weaknesses make them unique characters in the Warhammer 40k universe, and their actions or potential actions will have a massive impact on the trajectory of Eldar civilization. Let's explore the prominent personalities and their potential role in the return of the Eldar gods. The first and most significant figure in this discussion is Aeneid, the god of death, who has become the focus of the Eldar's hopes for resurrection. Unlike the other Eldar gods who were once associated with aspects of life, beauty, or war, Aeneid represents an understanding of death and an acceptance of its inevitability. Many Eldar now view Aeneid as the key to not only the revival of their gods, but also the survival of their race. Aeneid's strength lies in its role as a god of death, symbolizing an end to suffering and the potential for a rebirth that is free of the excess and folly that led to the fall. However, this god's nature is not without its flaws. Death, while a natural part of the cycle, is often seen as a finality in itself. The idea of death as a merciful force can also be perceived as cold, distant, and potentially unyielding. Therefore, while Aeneid offers hope for salvation, there is also a sense of doom that accompanies its presence, an inevitable pull towards the void. The weakness of this view lies in its potential to strip away hope for rebirth, focusing solely on the inevitable end. Many Eldar, particularly those who are more traditional or rely on the older gods, may see this as a form of spiritual coldness, while others may find in it a much-needed path to escape the torment of their previous lives. The second god closely tied to this theme is Cain, the god of war and bloodshed. Cain was one of the most revered gods of the Eldar before the fall, embodying their martial prowess and strength in battle. His domain over war and bloodshed made him a figure both admired and feared. His followers were among the most fanatical, and his warriors, the Incubi, remained some of the most elite soldiers in the galaxy. Cain's strength lies in his ability to inspire courage, strength, and fury in battle, making him an essential figure for a race that has long since relied on its martial prowess for survival. However, Cain's aggression and thirst for bloodshed also made him one of the most dangerous gods for the Eldar. His obsession with war led him to foster a culture of endless conflict, a trend that contributed to the eventual downfall of the Eldar race. In the aftermath of the fall, Cain's power was shattered, and much of his influence was lost to time. While his return could empower the Eldar with strength and courage, it could also reignite the same destructive tendencies that led to their near extinction. Thus, Cain embodies both the Eldar's greatest potential and their greatest risk. Then there is Isha, the goddess of fertility, healing, and the nurturing aspects of life. Isha represents the Eldar's connection to nature and their reverence for life itself. She is often depicted as a figure of grace, healing, and protection, offering care to those in need. Her strength lies in her ability to bring balance and restore life where there is decay. However, the absence of Isha after the fall left a gaping hole in the Eldar's ability to nurture and care for their dying race. The weaknesses of Isha's influence can be seen in her passivity. Unlike the active intervention of other gods like Cain, Isha's nurturing aspect could be seen as too gentle in the harsh and unforgiving galaxy. She represents a calm and restorative power, but this approach is often less effective in the face of overwhelming threats and violence. Some Eldar view her absence as a reason for the slow decay of their people, as the Eldar race's decline was not just caused by external threats, but by an internal spiritual crisis that could have been mitigated by Isha's presence. If she were to return, she would need to balance her nurturing power with a more proactive approach, lest she allow the Eldar to fall back into passivity and decline. Alongside the gods, there are other key figures in the Eldar pantheon whose actions could directly or indirectly influence the return of the gods. The Farseers are among the most notable of these figures. Gifted with psychic power, Farseers hold the responsibility of guiding the Eldar, interpreting the visions of the future, and making crucial decisions that will shape the fate of the race. Their strength lies in their ability to peer into the future, sensing both the opportunities and dangers that lie ahead. However, this foresight is not without its drawbacks. The Farseers' visions are often clouded by the warp and the vast complexities of fate, and they are as prone to error as they are to brilliance. Additionally, their reliance on their psychic gifts has created a dependency on the warp, a power that is not always fully understood or controllable. The Farseers are divided in their approach to the potential return of the gods. Some believe that reviving the gods is the only hope for the Eldar, while others fear that doing so will bring the same chaos that led to their race's near extinction. This internal conflict within the Farseers highlights their vulnerability. While they possess immense power, their visions are limited by their mortal constraints and their inability to fully understand or control the cosmic forces they deal with can lead to catastrophic results. Then there are the Dark Eldar, a group of Eldar who forsook the gods and embraced a darker path in order to survive the chaos and pain of the fall. The Dark Eldar are often seen as the opposite of the Eldar, focusing on selfishness, excess, and indulgence rather than the more spiritual or martial virtues of their ancestors. While they have prospered through their ability to feed off the suffering of others, the Dark Eldar also suffer from a deep existential crisis. The absence of the Eldar gods in their society has led them to become cruel and decadent, but their need for the souls of others to survive speaks to a spiritual emptiness that is inherent in their culture. The return of the gods could change the Dark Eldar in profound ways, particularly if they embrace a more balanced view of existence. The strength of the Dark Eldar lies in their cunning, resourcefulness, and ruthlessness. However, their greatest weakness is their inability to escape the cycle of pain and excess that defines their existence. Their connection to the gods, if re-established, would force them to confront the reality of their degeneration and would require a fundamental change in their way of life, an incredibly difficult and unlikely transformation. Lastly, there is aeldari leadership, which plays a critical role in shaping the future of the Eldar gods. The autarchs and corsairs, leaders who operate at the highest levels of Eldar society, are responsible for guiding the race's war efforts and coordinating their resources. These individuals possess strategic minds and unparalleled skills in warfare, but their ability to deal with the return of the gods is largely based on their political power and the will of their people. They too face a dilemma, whether to welcome back the gods and risk repeating past mistakes, or to continue surviving through less direct means, relying on their intellect and resourcefulness to avoid becoming too dependent on divine intervention. The struggle for control over the return of the gods, whether it is a communal effort or one driven by specific factions, has profound implications for the Eldar race as a whole. In conclusion, the personalities tied to the return of the Eldar gods are as complex and multifaceted as the gods themselves. From Ennead, the cold and final god of death, to the martial fury of Cain, each figure represents a different aspect of Eldar culture and the cosmic forces that govern their existence. Their strengths and weaknesses, as well as the internal struggles they face, underscore the magnitude of the challenge posed by the return of the Eldar gods. Whether these deities will return, and what their influence will mean for the galaxy, is a question that will continue to captivate Warhammer 40k fans, as the fate of the Eldar race hangs in the balance. The potential return of the Eldar gods is a topic steeped in ambiguity, with many unresolved questions and theories circulating in the Warhammer 40k community. While the idea holds enormous implications for the future of the Eldar race, the galaxy, and even the fabric of the universe itself, certain aspects of this issue remain shrouded in mystery. These unresolved issues fuel much of the fan discussion, offering a wealth of speculation and theories that both excite and confuse. Let's dive into some of the most intriguing and hotly debated questions and theories surrounding the return of the Eldar gods. One of the most compelling theories is that the Eldar gods may not be entirely gone from the material universe. While it is widely accepted that they were shattered by the birth of Slaanesh, some believe that they might still exist in a diminished or dormant state, waiting for the right circumstances to return. The theory suggests that the gods, in their original form, were not entirely destroyed, but rather transformed into new entities or fragments of their former selves. Some believe that the gods' consciousnesses could be lingering in the warp, their power too great to be fully erased. This would imply that their return could be more of a resurrection than a rebirth, a reawakening of the old powers who had been silenced by the calamity of Slaanesh. However, the question remains: if this is true, what could trigger their return, and would it be a gradual process or something more sudden? This theory raises many additional questions. Could the Eldar find a way to communicate with the remnants of their gods? Are the gods truly just waiting, or are they trapped by forces beyond their control? This unresolved issue leaves fans to wonder if the gods' return could be an internal spiritual journey, or if it would be a cosmic event with far-reaching consequences. A related issue concerns the nature of Ennead, the god of death. Some speculate that Ennead may represent more than just a god of death in a traditional sense. Instead, they argue that Ennead could be an embodiment of the cycle of life and death for the entire Eldar race. Some theories posit that Ennead is the only Eldar god whose return could fully restore the Eldar to their former power, or at least give them a fighting chance against the forces of chaos. But does this mean that Ennead could be the only Eldar god that survives the cataclysmic events of the fall? Furthermore, some wonder whether Ennead's return would automatically lead to the resurrection of other gods, or if it would mark the beginning of a new pantheon altogether. Could the creation of Ennead have been a result of the Eldar's desperation to forge a new path after the destruction of their old gods? Or is Ennead something altogether different, a new entity with its own unique goals that could be at odds with the Eldar's previous gods? Another significant point of debate centers around the possibility that the return of the Eldar gods could be disastrous, not just for the Eldar, but for the galaxy as a whole. The events of the fall were a result of the Eldar gods' own excesses and failures, and some believe that their return would only bring chaos, destruction, and strife once more. Could the Eldar gods, having already destroyed their race once, be capable of such destruction again? Would their return represent a second chance for the Eldar, or would it merely reawaken their old flaws? This theory posits that the Eldar gods, while immensely powerful, may be ill-suited to lead the Eldar to salvation. Instead, their return could bring about another catastrophic event that leads to even more ruin for their people. But would the Eldar gods even be the same beings they once were? Could they have changed, evolved, or adapted during their absence, or would they be forever tainted by the events of the fall? And if they do return, what will the Eldar need to do to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated? A related theory brings up the possibility that the return of the Eldar gods would signal a shift in power, not just for the Eldar, but for all the races of the galaxy. If the Eldar gods were to return in full force, it could potentially upset the balance of power in the galaxy. The gods were once forces to be reckoned with, and their return could bring new weapons, tactics, and capabilities to the Eldar. Some fans speculate that this could spark a new era of Eldar dominance, as the gods provide the Eldar with the means to confront their enemies with more power than they have ever had before. However, other fans worry that such a return could ignite a massive war, not just with the forces of chaos, but with the Imperium, Orcs, Necrons, and all the other races of the galaxy. Would the return of the Eldar gods be an opportunity for peace and prosperity, or would it lead to a new war that stretches across the galaxy? Another theory posits that the return of the Eldar gods would fundamentally change the nature of the Eldar themselves. The gods' departure from the material realm has left a mark on the Eldar people, who have been forced to adapt to a universe without the guiding influence of their deities. Many have turned to the worship of Ennead, hoping that this god will be their salvation, but there is little consensus on what will happen when the gods return. Will the Eldar embrace them once more, or will they reject the old pantheon in favor of a new way of life? Some believe that the Eldar have moved beyond their gods, evolving into a new, more self-reliant species that no longer needs the divine to guide them. However, others think that the Eldar, having seen the destruction brought on by the loss of their gods, will eagerly welcome them back with open arms. What role would the Eldar gods play in their lives, and would they be seen as saviors or as harbingers of doom? The role of Slaanesh in all of this is also a contentious subject. As the god responsible for the fall, Slaanesh remains a significant figure in the lives of the Eldar, whether they like it or not. Could the return of the Eldar gods trigger a battle with Slaanesh, who still holds sway over the souls of the Eldar in the warp? Some theories suggest that the gods could rise again, only to face Slaanesh in a final decisive battle for the Eldar's souls. But this raises the question, would the Elder gods be strong enough to defeat Slaanesh, or would the return of the gods lead to a resurgence of Slaanesh's power? The balance of power between the two is delicate, and the return of the Elder gods could lead to a war that could forever alter the nature of the warp and its influence on the material universe. Could Slaanesh's power be diminished or eliminated entirely with the gods' return, or would this only cause further chaos and suffering? A particularly interesting theory concerns the nature of the warp itself. Some theorize that the return of the Eldar gods would not only affect the Eldar, but also have far-reaching consequences for the warp. The gods were not only part of the material universe, but also connected to the warp in unique ways. Their return could either stabilize or destabilize the warp itself, altering the nature of the psychic powers that all races rely on. Could the Eldar gods, in their return, act as a counterbalance to the chaotic forces that dominate the warp, or would they add to the instability, intensifying the conflict between the gods of chaos and the other forces within the warp? The very fabric of reality could be affected, and the answer to this question could determine the fate of not only the Eldar, but also every race that relies on the warp. Lastly, there is the question of whether the Eldar gods should return at all. While many long for their return, others argue that the gods' absence may have been a blessing in disguise. The return of the gods could bring with it the return of the flaws that led to the Eldar's downfall in the first place. Would their return be an opportunity for growth and renewal, or would it simply be a return to the same destructive patterns that defined their civilization's peak? Some theorists argue that the Eldar must move beyond their old gods and forge a new future for themselves, one that is no longer burdened by the mistakes of the past. Could the Eldar create a new path forward without relying on the return of their ancient deities? Or is the return of the gods inevitable in the face of their race's existential crisis? The topic of the Eldar Gods Return is full of speculation, contradictions, and deep questions that have yet to be answered. While fans can only speculate on these unresolved issues, the mysteries surrounding the gods' potential return continue to be a major point of intrigue in the Warhammer 40k universe. Theories abound, and as new developments occur in the lore, it's likely that more questions will arise, keeping the discussion about the Eldar Gods' return alive and ongoing. The return of the Eldar Gods is a topic that would undoubtedly reshape the fabric of the Warhammer 40k universe. The long-term consequences of such an event would stretch across time and space, affecting not only the Eldar race, but all factions within the galaxy. The return of these ancient deities could trigger an era of great upheaval, with potential ramifications for the balance of power, the direction of galactic conflict, and the very nature of reality itself. However, the question remains, would these consequences be ultimately positive or negative? And perhaps more importantly, is it even necessary or desirable for the Eldar gods to return at all? To begin, the most immediate and significant consequence of the return of the Eldar gods would be the re-establishment of the Eldar as a major force in the galaxy. Historically, the Eldar gods were the focal point of their civilization, guiding them and providing them with the power and wisdom to dominate the galaxy. With their loss, the Eldar were cast into a slow decline, culminating in their near extinction. The re-emergence of these gods could serve as a catalyst for the Eldar's resurgence, providing them with the strength and unity they have lacked since the fall. They might regain their old abilities, their dominion over psychic powers, and the confidence that once made them the most advanced and influential race in the galaxy. However, this resurgence may not be without its dangers. The return of the gods could reawaken the deep flaws that led to the fall in the first place. The Eldar gods were not infallible. Far from it. Their arrogance, their indulgence, and their excessive nature were what ultimately birthed Slaanesh and brought about the collapse of their once great civilization. Reintroducing these gods into the Eldar's collective consciousness could reignite the same hubris and excesses that led to their downfall, this time on an even larger scale. The Eldar may become too reliant on their gods, returning to their old ways of overindulgence and decadence. The cycle of destruction could repeat itself, leading the Eldar down a path of self-destruction yet again. In addition to the dangers of a return to excess, the re-emergence of the gods would likely reignite the cosmic struggle between the Eldar and the forces of chaos. The Chaos Gods, especially Slaanesh, still hold a significant influence over the Eldar, particularly their souls. The gods' return would almost certainly spark a war in the warp, with Slaanesh seeking to reclaim the souls of the Eldar, while the gods fight to protect their people. This could lead to a massive conflict within the warp, disrupting the psychic landscape and potentially leading to a great reckoning that affects not only the Eldar, but every faction that uses the warp for travel and power. But beyond the immediate consequences for the Eldar, the return of these gods could have profound effects on the entire galaxy. The balance of power between the factions would be thrown into disarray. The Eldar, already formidable with their advanced technology, psychic abilities, and long histories, would become even more powerful with the support of their gods. This could tilt the balance of power in the galaxy, leading to new conflicts or escalating existing ones. The Imperium, already facing numerous external and internal threats, would view the return of the Eldar gods as a major crisis. The potential for the Eldar to gain ascendancy again would be seen as an existential threat, and the Imperium might take drastic measures to counteract it, leading to further warfare and possibly even the collapse of existing alliances. The forces of chaos would certainly have their own stake in the matter. The return of the Eldar gods could be seen as a direct challenge to their influence, particularly that of Slaanesh. If the Eldar gods are able to reassert their dominion over the Eldar race, it could be a significant blow to Slaanesh's power, as the Eldar would no longer be bound to the god of excess. This could lead to a vicious conflict between the Eldar gods and the Chaos gods, as Slaanesh would likely seek to destroy the Eldar gods once and for all. The nature of this conflict would be cosmic in scale, with the fates of entire races hanging in the balance. It would also deepen the rift between the forces of chaos and those who stand against them, possibly leading to new alliances or greater divisions. From a more philosophical standpoint, the return of the Eldar gods could fundamentally alter the nature of existence in the galaxy. The gods were not simply deities of the Eldar, they were powerful psychic entities whose influence touched upon the fabric of reality itself. If they were to return, they would bring with them a new understanding of the universe, one that could have far-reaching consequences for every race in the galaxy. The very nature of the warp and its relationship to the material realm could be redefined, and new technologies or ways of thinking could emerge from the teachings of these gods. But whether this would be a positive or negative shift is difficult to determine. Could the return of the gods lead to a new age of enlightenment for the Eldar, or would it merely fuel their obsession with their own superiority, setting them on a path of arrogance and hubris once again? There is also the question of the broader impact on the galaxy's other xenospecies. The Eldar gods were known for their profound psychic powers and their ability to shape the future of their people. If they were to return, would the Eldar seek to extend their influence over the other races? Could they impose their will upon the galaxy once more, bringing about a new order under their divine guidance? Or would the gods, in their re-emergence, focus solely on the Eldar, leaving the other races to continue their struggles without interference? It is difficult to predict how the galaxy would respond to the return of these powerful beings, but it is certain that the dynamics between the various factions would be irrevocably altered. Furthermore, the Eldar Gods' return could raise new questions about the nature of the universe itself. The forces of chaos, the Imperium, and the other factions in the galaxy all operate within the constraints of the material universe and the warp. The Eldar gods, as powerful warp entities, have the potential to transcend these limitations and alter the very structure of reality. Would their return signal the beginning of a new cosmic era, one in which the rules of the universe are rewritten? Or would the gods' re-emergence only serve to maintain the status quo, locking the galaxy in an endless cycle of warfare and strife? Another long-term consequence of the Eldar gods' return is the possibility of a renewed spiritual awakening for the Eldar people. After the fall, the Eldar became spiritually adrift, disconnected from the pantheon that once defined them. The return of the gods could reinvigorate the Eldar's faith and culture, offering them a sense of purpose and unity that they have lacked for millennia. It could restore the Eldar to their former glory, allowing them to forge a new destiny that might involve healing the damage caused by the fall. However, this could also be a double-edged sword. If the Gods' Return simply revives the old ways, it could trap the Eldar in a cycle of repeating the same mistakes, preventing them from evolving and adapting to the changing realities of the galaxy. There is also the issue of whether the return of the gods would truly be beneficial for the galaxy at large. Would the Eldar gods bring about a new age of peace and enlightenment, or would their return merely escalate the conflicts that already ravage the galaxy? The galaxy is already filled with existential threats, from the Tyranids to the Necrons to the forces of chaos. The arrival of the Eldar gods could be another factor that tips the scales of the galactic conflict, for better or for worse. It could usher in a new era of stability, or it could plunge the galaxy into deeper chaos, depending on how the Eldar and their gods interact with the other races. Ultimately, the long-term consequences of the Eldar Gods' Return are difficult to predict, and their impact on the galaxy could be both profound and unpredictable. The question of whether the gods should return is equally complex. While the Eldar would undoubtedly benefit from their gods' guidance and power, the rest of the galaxy may find their return to be a destabilizing force that upends the existing balance of power. It is unclear whether their return would lead to salvation or destruction for the Eldar, and whether it would be a positive or negative development for the galaxy as a whole. Regardless of the outcome, the return of the Eldar gods would be a turning point in the history of the Warhammer 40k universe, one that would shape the future for millennia to come.